Good afternoon and welcome everybody, and thank you for attending today's webinar on data breach discovery, sponsored by our friends at ACEDS and hosted by BIA. My name is Mark McDonald. I'm the Senior Vice President of Business Development here at BIA, and today we're thrilled to have Ryan Bilbrey, a disputes and investigations expert from Reckoning Consulting Partners, and Chris Dix, a founding and valued member of the ACEDS Jacksonville chapter and partner at Smith Hulsey and Busey. Ryan and Chris will be defining the issues, presenting best practices and solutions for how to handle a data breach. We're also going to talk a little bit about the people, the processes, and the technology that are needed to help mitigate a breach. These days, it's well known that CIOs and CSSP's top 5 issues are external threats, changes in business infrastructure, data loss, and an ever-changing market. External threats are the #1 concern for most organizations, and we know that organized crime is a driving factor in major attacks. The reason for this is purely financial. Attacks can be sophisticated and simple, but 2 things are for sure. You will be attacked, and nothing is secure. So with that, I'm going to turn the conversation over to Ryan and Chris. We look forward to a great discussion. Please forward your questions through the UI, and we're going to reserve 10 or 15 minutes at the end. For those questions we can't get to, we'll respond to and post on our blog, and we'll send everybody that's attending today access to that as well as a copy of the presentation. Ryan?
Chris?
Thanks, guys.
Welcome. You want to lead us off?
I will. Before we get down into the weeds today and talk about these eDiscovery issues within the breach context, I want to provide a little bit of a backdrop for the listeners on what exactly are we talking about when we're talking about a data breach. The first slide that we have here talks a little bit about the unauthorized access, use, or retrieval of data by an individual, group, application, or service. And it's really, that's a baseline kind of definition. The reality of companies and people these days is that we live in a country with 50 states, that has a federal government, and all the states and federal government have a variety of different agencies, all of which are, interested in protecting their constituents. So there's a wide variety of different laws and regulations that are increasingly defining this term breach and data breach. One difference that we see is that in some states like Florida considers unauthorized access to data to be a breach, whereas in some other states and jurisdictions, you actually have to have someone using or taking the data, exfiltrating the data, in order for it to be considered a breach. And so you've got to understand the definition of what a breach is in the jurisdictions that are applicable to you in order to determine whether you've actually had a breach. The other big issue I wanted to touch on before we move much further is it relates to ransomware. I think in the early days of hearing about ransomware, a lot of people considered ransomware not to be a breach. And the reason was that in the early days, you'd click on an email and open up a computer program that would begin to encrypt your data. And you pay the ransom, and it was relatively small amounts of money, and then the program would decrypt your data. You'd be right back to, hopefully, being able to continue on. These days, the ransomware tends to be the tail end of a much larger nefarious problem, kind of as Mark suggested just a minute ago. These days, you'll click on an email that has a PDF or a Word document, which deploys a very small, innocent-looking program onto your computer or system. That program is then used to deploy a secondary set of programs and software, which then takes a look at your network and either finds where the data might be stored or collects information like usernames and passwords. And then once the usernames and passwords have been collected, a third or even fourth wave of bad software programs are deployed on your system, and those are finally usually when the ransomware shows up, and it gets deployed in a strategic, intentional way by the bad actors, and they're targeting particular companies or people and systems, and they know all about the systems by the time they finally get to triggering the ransomware attack and disabling your system. And many times the ransomware is intended to cover the tracks or to divert attention away from the fact that they have maybe taken information from you. And while you're dealing with trying to retrieve your data, the bad guys are getting away and never to be found again. And so I just wanted to kind of cover that at the beginning here, because I think there's sometimes a misperception that ransomware is not actually a breach. The other little kind of trick for people that are covered by HIPAA is that the HIPAA security rule requires covered entities and business associates have to ensure the confidentiality, integrity, and availability of electronic personal health information. And so if you've got ransomware and your data is encrypted, even though it's remaining confidential and the integrity is not going anywhere, the availability is not there. And so you may have what is ultimately determined not to be a data breach because the personal health information didn't get taken by the bad actors, but you might have a HIPAA breach, a HIPAA violation, because the data of your patients was no longer available or was unavailable during a critical time. With medical providers, if you've got a hospital and you need to get access to people's medical records, even for a short period of time, that could have drastic effects. And so, and one last thing, increasingly people are obtaining cyber insurance. A lot of companies these days don't even have that coverage. Many people are figuring that out and getting the coverage. And it's important to think about, what does your insurance company, if you have cyber insurance, what do they consider to be a breach? Because if you don't fall within that definition, or if you don't report an event to them that falls within that category, then even though you might have purchased insurance, you might not be able to take advantage of it. So people don't often think about insurance when they're having a breach, but it's something to consider.
I think that's a very good points, Chris, and I'd like to kind of echo and expand on a couple of those. One is that it's not necessarily just an external party, and you kind of hit on this, but one of the the big things that happens are insider threats. People inside a company that are that are stealing data, exfiltrating in some way. That's as much a risk as anything else. You've also got employee errors and negligence, which kind of ties into the HIPAA concerns you had. I mean, there are things that people could do that could accidentally expose data. This happens on a pretty regular basis, and that's still considered a data breach. It's something to think about. So it's intentional, it's unintentional, it's inside, it's outside, it's all over the place. And as you mentioned, the definitions are so broadly ranging, state by state, jurisdiction by jurisdiction, that a lot of what we're going to talk about today is I'm not going to say it's generalities, but we're talking kind of like a composite picture of what you do in a data breach, not necessarily any one particular case in any one jurisdiction, but kind of some general rules that bring a lot of this stuff together. And I guess to sum up this slide, and we'll move on from here, is that as it says at the bottom of the slide there, data breaches are hugely impactful to companies. Cost money, reputational damage, time. I mean, there is a data breach can lead to a loss of customer base that leads to a measurable loss in revenue. So it's a very significant, not just the direct costs of dealing with the data breach, but the downstream costs, business costs as you move from there. So that's great. So we'll move on to the next slide here, which is a little bit of discussion about the scope of data breaches. So on the screen are some numbers from 2017, over 1,500 data breaches, 158 million Social Security numbers exposed. That was a big jump in the number of breaches from 2016. And you also see the number there, that's the 3.86 million typical data breach cost. That is worldwide. The U.S. is actually the most expensive place in the world to have a data breach and to deal with the data breach. The costs of dealing with that are much higher here. And between 2017 and 2018, it's actually kind of interesting. The number of breaches actually went down slightly from 2017 to 18, but the number of PII records that were exposed was actually up pretty dramatically, like 126% up. Also, the cost of a breach is going up. I think there's a lot more focus on it, and more scrutiny about what you do post-breach.
Ryan, do you think that's because hackers are getting smarter and more targeted in their attacks?
I think that's definitely the case. There's also some, 2018 saw some very specific incidents. Marriott, and sorry if anybody out there's from Marriott, I'm not meaning to throw you under the bus by any means, but Marriott's data breach in 2018 had 383 million people worldwide affected by their breach with some serious information. Facebook had a pretty significant breach, and Google had actually two different breaches, each of more than 50 million accounts. So those numbers add up very quickly for something at these large-scale things. But I think there definitely is focus because everybody knows where the data is right now. Chris, what are you seeing in your practice with regarding scope and such?
I think it was said earlier, but we're shifting our mentality from a mindset where we take measures to prevent an attack to take measures to mitigate the attack, assuming it's going to happen. And so the numbers are such that it's irresponsible in some ways to not be thinking that you're going to have a problem and to go ahead and take steps to plan for and deal with the remediation before it happens. And so I tell people that regularly that I'd rather talk to you before you have an incident than afterwards, because we can plan some things and do some things and put some procedures in place so that if and when there is an incident, and there will be, then we're not scrambling to figure out what we're going to do. Everybody has a plan, and you follow it, and that substantially reduces the impact and the cost. There's a lot of studies that have been done about the cost of a breach and how to mitigate that. And one of the big things is, it seems obvious, but to have a plan on what to do and know what to do when a breach occurs. And even it's as simple as, do the people in your company understand what a breach is? If you just were to ask someone in your company, how would you know when there's a data breach or a cyber attack going on? Unless the people have had training and have prepared for that, you get a variety of answers. And in some cases, you might have employees that are noticing things and not thinking that they're a problem or not reporting them. That ultimately exacerbates the damage and the impact once someone finally figures out that you've got a problem. So that's kind of what I'm seeing, on the ground as things are happening, unfortunately.
Chris, it's funny, some of what you just said rings true for eDiscovery. For the last 20 years, we've been talking about building a process and having a plan in place, and now here we are facing a new challenge, data breach discovery, and the same rings true, right? Have a plan, have it in place, be prepared for when it happens.
Yeah, and we're going to get to that a little bit later. I mean, I think that's the core of what we're talking about here is that exact topic.
Yeah, Mark,
so,
real
Chris,
quick,
you want to? Yeah,
hold on. I wanted to add one thing on that. I wanted to give a nod to all the information governance people, if there are any, that are listening here, because if you've got a breach and you have been neglecting to get rid of all your data that you don't need anymore at your company, then that exacerbates the problem, and in terms of cost and in time. And so, as best you can, and it's a good benefit to controlling your data so that you can reduce your eDiscovery costs by not having as much data that you need to collect, review, process, produce. The same goes for data breaches. If you're not having the large footprint, then it can substantially help you contain and deal with the problem once it happens.
Good points.
Cool. So moving on, Chris, I think we've already had some discussion about some of the elements of what we have here on the screen, but do you want to expand a little bit about some of the different types of private data that are out there, and as well as just kind of revisit some of the disclosure requirements?
Yeah, our slide here talks about PII, PHI, it's got FERPA, PCI, and GDPR. That's a lot of different letters. And, you know, the reality I see is that, unfortunately, companies don't necessarily know what regulations they're subject to before they have an incident. In an ideal world, you would know who you're supposed to report to when you have an incident before you have that incident. And you'd know what kind of regulations you're subject to so that you can plan for and address those things. But the reality is that a lot of people, PCI is one good example. A lot of companies don't really know or focus on the fact that they're governed, if they take credit card payments, they're governed by a set of rules that the payment card industry came up with. And the consequences of not complying with those rules is that credit card companies can charge you, the business, a lot more per transaction. And in some cases, it's depending on your margins of each sale that you make, it could be the difference in whether you're making a profit or not. I know of small businesses that have been basically gone out of business because they couldn't afford to pay the higher payment card fee that was imposed on them after they didn't comply with the rules. So I encourage anyone that's listening that doesn't know what regulations they're subject to, now's the time. Figure that out, and that way, when it comes time, when you do have an incident, you don't have to figure this out on the fly as you're trying to deal with the other issues that were talked about earlier, the business interruption, the potential reputational harm. You'd rather be focusing on getting things back up and running than trying to figure out who's going to be showing up on your doorstep to start asking a bunch of questions. Another thing I want to mention, too, before we move on, is the regulators, I think it's fairly universal, regardless of whether which jurisdiction you're in. I see this regularly where a company will say, well, we don't know how many people were affected by this incident. And I think companies are hoping that the regulators will say, oh, well, that's okay. How about your best guess? Or just round it down and assume it's not that bad. No, the reality is, and I've seen it, is that almost uniformly a regulator will say, if you can't prove which data and which customers were impacted by an incident, that you have to assume that it's everyone. That means you have to tell all those people. In many jurisdictions, if 500 people is the threshold for whether you got to notify everybody, and that's the deciding factor in most cases, puts it over that 500 for sure. You don't know whether it's 501 or 5,000 or 5 million, but in any event, it's a number that you have to assume is as big as possible. And that kind of takes us into what we're going to talk about for the balance of this presentation. And if you're in a situation where you've got to assume that all of your customers or all of the data that you had might have been accessed, well, how do you go about identifying who those people are and how to contact them? And so with that, let's move to that next slide on data breach response.
Chris, just to follow up with that, one of the things that I've seen with that whole what's the threshold, do we notify, I've had clients that have said, why don't we just notify everyone? And on one hand, sure, that's cheaper, but there's a couple downsides. You are opening yourself wide up to downstream litigation. Also, invariably, there is data that almost every company has in their system that isn't just their customers, that isn't just their own people. You get data from all kinds of strange places, and it would be rare to be able to say just my customers. So that is an answer. In my opinion, it's not necessarily a very good answer.
Brian, I like to.
Yeah.
Brian, I like to ask back. Well, what do you mean by everyone? As it's not just a spreadsheet that has your customers. How do you know who everyone is? And sometimes once you figure out who everyone is, maybe there's a different opinion of whether we ought to contact all those people.
Yeah, that's exactly right. One other point here, and then we'll move on. We've talked about how the different laws, the different states, different jurisdictions, et cetera. Right here on the screen, we have just 5 of the different types of private data. Well, as it turns out, data breaches don't happen just in each of those lanes. You don't have just a breach for one thing or just a breach for another necessarily. It would be very rare that you don't have at least a couple of those things. I mean, I've almost always seen, even in a PII project, there's PHI in there. Maybe and then we're moving toward a brave new world as of last year with GDPR. So it's a complicated, interwoven, interconnected web of problems here that we're trying to address. And so with that, let's move on to the response. The term data breach response I think is pretty commonly used, pretty commonly known, and maybe it's not particularly defined. We usually think about that in terms of the actual investigation. What happened? How did it happen? How are we going to fix it? What was exposed? It also gets into proactive planning and in investigations. And then kind of there's this big gap of what happens in the middle, and then you notify everybody. And this has struck me for at least a couple of years now, where it's kind of this area of just like magically you get all these names and you know how to notify. I mean, I'm sure almost everyone that's on this call, including you, including me, we've all got that letter from somebody that said, apologies, but your data was exposed. How did they get to that point? That's what we're going to get to here in a couple minutes. Almost every breach, verified breach of any size, is going to require some sort of notification, whether it's a notification to law enforcement and state authorities, regulatory body, or to the individuals. It's this is happening all day, every day. And we'll focus on the U.S. mostly, but it's in every state, it's everywhere. So it's this is a very big, broad, wide-ranging problem. Chris, do you work with? We're going to talk today about that. How do we get that data? How do we find those people? But do you work with the companies that actually do that? The kind of the incident response type things. And we'll touch on this and then I think move on. But do you have experience working with those kinds of companies?
Yes, there are several. I won't go into individual names. I don't want to promote one over the other, but there are a couple that kind of dominate the industry. They do a very good job, but they're very expensive. They come in with a team of people, and their hourly rates are for each member of their team typically exceed my hourly rate, and they're there for weeks. And so that's an area where cyber insurance comes in. If you've got insurance to pay for those kind of efforts, that can save your company. You've got to do those things. You've got to remediate. But if your insurance company is paying for it rather than the company having to pay for it, that can be the difference between surviving and not. The other thing too that comes up as we're kind of in this magical area here is how quickly do we need to tell the people that we have to tell. And the time frames are getting a lot shorter. HIPAA has a 60-day notification time frame, and you can actually they have a list of all the breaches that have been reported to OCR. You can go on the list and sort it by your state. You can search by name. We used to call it the wall of shame. But that has a 60-day window. The Florida data breach notification rules have a 30-day time frame. And GDPR, I believe, is somewhere around 72 hours before you've got to tell certain regulators, maybe not everyone at 72-hour mark, but you're making disclosures 72 hours after you have, first time you realize that you have an incident. 72 hours in, you're usually still, the hair's on fire and you're running around trying to recover. It's not the time you want to go and make disclosures to regulators, and then they show up and start asking more questions while you're still trying to get back on your feet and manage client relationships and restore order. So I think the key...
That's right on the money. That's right on the money, Chris.
Brian, the key I found is that we just talked about a variety of different people and things that have to get done. You got to have at least a plan and a list of the people that are on your call list, and make it a list that you don't store on your computer that you're not going to be able to get to when you have a ransomware attack. And tell people to print that out. If you print one thing, print your data breach response plan out and have it in hard copy somewhere so that you can know what to do when you can't get to your computer. But have that team in place, figure out who those people are, and have that set up before you have an incident.
Yep. Yeah. Response time it's always been fast. It's getting faster, and it's not going backwards. If anything, it's going to be moving towards more and more tighter and tighter requirements on that time frame. So, Chris, let's move on. So we've led up to this. So let's just lay it out right here. So what's the challenge we're facing here? We'll talk about structured data, i.e. data that's in databases that's exposed. But I mean, the real problem that as I see is a huge amounts of email and loose files that can often be exposed. You have an email server that's exposed with attachments. I mean, it gets very big, very quick. And again, we're stating this in general terms. There's almost infinite variations on what it can be depending on location or whatnot. But the challenge is we've got this huge amount of unstructured data. We have to quantify the issue for law enforcement and regulatory reporting, and then most likely notification lists for the affected individuals. I mean, it's just a huge thing. I have a stat up here. This is just kind of my back of the envelope calculation, but in my mind, 25 email boxes, standard email boxes that people use every day, could yield as many as 1 million documents. And that sounds like a lot. When you're sitting down at the computer to try to actually get through 1 million documents, that's a daunting number. That's a really big, really expensive number.
And some of these documents can have multiple people's PII on them, so it's not like a typical eDiscovery type of process.
That's exactly right.
It's very specialized and requires special processes.
That's right. I mean, we'll get into that in 2 more slides. We're going to get to kind of the actual workflow, but there are some commonalities with the eDiscovery workflow, and we certainly leverage a lot of that, but it's a very different process. And if the company has never been through that, it's a task that is terrifying.
You don't want to learn on the fly.
Yeah, you don't want to, just like Chris said, have a plan, because the time to invent and write the plan is not when you've got a breach and all the notification and everything else hanging over your head.
Hard to change a tire at 100 miles an hour.
That is exactly correct.
Sorry.
No, that's exactly correct. Chris, anything from you there? Or you want to pop on
I do think that there's, for the eDiscovery people that aren't data security people, or even vice versa, that we're at the part here where there is a decent amount of overlap. You've got an incident which is causing you to have to look at all the data that you've got to figure out, depending on whether you're trying to find names and contact information or whether you're trying to find documents or things that are related to a lawsuit. It's a specialized form of that when you're dealing with data security. But the process, I think, is something that is easier for people that have done eDiscovery before to kind of understand and do. It's harder, I think, for the data security folks that aren't used to the post, put the fire out, kind of get back to order. That it's harder for them to understand what comes next. So if you're an eDiscovery person, I think you're in a good place to learn what we're about to talk about.
Right, and with that, let's move on to the solution. Start talking about how do we actually do this. I think that's what the meat of this is really about. So we call the solution data breach discovery. It's data breach, but it's not the investigation. It's not necessarily the notification. It's that bridge process. So so data breach discovery, quick, efficient, cost-effective review of all the stuff that we've been talking about. And how do we do this? What are the keys to success? I've got some bullets up here on this slide. So eDiscovery principles, and I'll add tools in. So we do almost all of these. If we're talking about unstructured data, we're going to go through that eDiscovery data processing deduplication process. We very likely will use keywords to a certain extent, and we're almost certainly going to leverage a review platform. A lot of options out there. I think probably everybody on this knows what the market leader is, and that's probably what a lot of people that are doing this are actually using. But all those eDiscovery tools are kind of the foundation of all this. Next, advanced text analytics. So things like named entity recognition, finding names, finding different pieces of information that might be pointers to PII, using regular expression searching to look for things like social security numbers. To a certain extent, clustering. It does certainly work, as particularly we're in the early stages of the exploratory process. Streamline workflows. We've kind of talked about that. This goes in with the have a plan. Even just this part of this is incredibly complicated, and you need to have a plan going into it. What is step one? What is step two? What is step three? You need to be flexible in it, because if the moment you are too rigid, your system's going to break. So you need to be able to be flexible on it, but to have a plan going in is so important. Database analysis. A few things that comes into play. One is you might get a structured data source that was breached. You might get a database. In my mind, that's relatively easy to deal with, because you've already got the data. It's all searchable. It's queryable. You can see it. You might be able to get from your client a list of names. We talked earlier that that would be great to get it. Customer list, the employee list from HR, things like that you can either use as a base, as a QA, QC backstop. Say, hey, I found these people. Do they actually exist? Things like that. And then at the end, the deduplication process. You're going to get a lot of duplicate individuals, most likely, are going to come out of this. And that process at the end to deduplicate that is going to be largely going to rely on the ability to do some pretty good database analysis. And then finally, and Chris, if you would weigh in on this, the detailed understanding of privacy issues. I mean, we've talked a lot about it, but put a bow on that for us, would you?
Sure. I think that the key is that you have to understand enough about what you're going to tell people before you tell them. I see this often. I think Equifax had a series of problems with this, where they're saying things and telling people things, and then it turns out to be different or only part of the full picture. And so I think you've got to go through and do all of these things, come up with that deduplicated, good quality final product before you can then intelligently interact with the regulators and with customers and with people that are being notified, even shareholders and owners of the company. And so if you start saying things and then having to change your tune, especially for regulators, their impression of whether you're doing a good job and did a good job and did what you could before the incident happened, that perspective goes negative, and you don't want that to happen. And so it's critical that all these steps take place and get done correctly, so that you've got the best information that you can provide. In much the same way that in an eDiscovery case, if you just produce a bunch of junk to the other side and hadn't really done a good job, going through it and eliminating things that weren't relevant or duplicate or things that were corrupted or password protected. If you give someone junk, they're gonna start thinking that you didn't do a good job or didn't know what you were doing, or trying to hide something. And with a data breach situation, you don't want the regulators thinking that you're trying to hide something.
Good, and I normally wouldn't read a bullet, but I want to read this one because I think it's important. Critical success factor: company, counsel, and consultants working together as a team. This is difficult. I mean, it's a high stress situation. There are different priorities, even within a company. The CIO might have a different priority than the CEO, or the chief marketing officer may be, thinking about messaging. So there are a lot of different, things that are pulling people in different directions. But it's really important to the overall success of this to get everybody going in the same direction, and also have, to have someone in charge, someone that's ultimately you can look at and say, okay, we're going to debate this for an hour, and at the end of this, somebody's going to make a decision. If there's one thing that we've talked about over and over here, it's that there's no single answer to this. There's no, bright shining path that you can walk down without fail, and having somebody that ultimately is going to make the call on how you're going to address these issues is absolutely vital. Absolutely vital.
Yeah, Brian, one other thing on that. I completely agree with you on having someone in charge, and I think part of what makes a good person in charge is making sure there's communication between the different groups that are working together, so they understand how they fit within the bigger picture and what new things are happening. I think a lot of times people are in the dark about what other people are doing, and that can lead to delays or confusion or like I mentioned before, things not being accurate or incomplete. And that's the worst kind of scenario. So sometimes having a PR firm or a company that's experienced with messaging, even if it's internal messaging, depending on the scope of the project, can be a really helpful tool to make sure everybody's doing the right thing in the right direction at the same time.
Yeah, that's a great point. Great point. So very briefly, look at this slide. So this is how we conceptualize this process, the data breach discovery process, at the very highest level. It's kind of just a simple mnemonic. Detect, assess, capture. Detect the breach, find the data, assess the data, capture the data. We don't need to spend a whole lot of time because we really want to spend kind of the rest of our time here talking about this, which is our detailed workflow slide. So there's a lot going on here. So let me just kind of set this up really quick. The upper area in the dark green is the incident response. These are the firms we were talking about before that are doing the actual investigation into the incident, evaluating the results. They're the ones that are probably going to make the call, was there actually a breach? And they may actually be doing the collection of those compromised data sources. I had mentioned before, we might have 25 mailboxes, we might have a file server, maybe a database. So they're likely the ones that would collect that. There's kind of a crossover point there from that to the quote data breach discovery part of it. So it could be the more downstream fall into that. But let's just say it's there. So we really want to focus on this lower part in the light green. So within that lower part, the data breach discovery section, the upper path of the workflow is database sources. I mean, as I mentioned, I personally think that dealing with databases is a lot easier. I come from somewhat of a database background for a very long time, so it's easy to deal with. You can see it, you can search it, you can query it. There shouldn't be anything that you can't really find. So just real quick, you get the source, you assess that source. You normalize the data so that you make sure you're looking at the right things, and you extract key names and data from it. You have to make that determination at that point, of course. Are we looking for PII? Are we looking for PHI? What exactly is the criteria? But I think it's a fairly straightforward process. The much more difficult process. Yeah, sir, Chris, go ahead.
Let me just add one thing about data. I think it's certainly key that if you have a database, you got to have the people there that know how to operate it. I've seen it in bankruptcy contexts where the people are gone, and even though you have good data, you don't have someone that understands how that data works or where it comes from, and what should be a relatively easy task becomes increasingly difficult. So you want to make sure you have the right personnel to deal with those databases. The other thing, too, is that we see this in eDiscovery, too. Database files don't make for good paper exhibits. Even Excel spreadsheets, if you've ever tried to print and convert an Excel spreadsheet to paper, database files are like that on steroids. If you don't think about what you really want at the end of the day and make sure you're doing your database queries in a way that gets you what you want, you can end up with something that isn't all that helpful. And even if you get what you want, I feel like that can be difficult to explain to people that aren't like you, Ryan, that don't understand databases. They don't understand where the information came from. And if you can't show them a piece of paper that has what you're looking for, then that causes confusion or concern. And so it's very important to have the right people to help you deal with that data, because it's so powerful. And so it is easier to get what you're looking for, but the devil's in the details. And I've just seen it where I have all the data and it's sitting right there, and yet I'm having a hard time turning it into something that can be easily presented to a judge or a regulator to explain the situation.
Yeah, I've sadly been through numerous projects in my past where somebody insisted that we print out a database, and
Right.
I feel like you maybe destroyed the better part of a North American forest and definitely used the better part of an office to store all of it. So you are absolutely right. What's the end game? What's the end goal? And let's do our analysis in that direction, and certainly have the right technical resources and the right subject matter expertise coming together to do this process.
One other thing, Ryan, sometimes a little bit of dialogue with the person that you're giving the information to can be helpful in that regard. So we've found that if we go to whoever we're producing that information to, say, what are you looking for? What do you need? And then if you begin with that end in mind, you can go back and get what they're looking for, and you don't end up producing something that's not what was wanted, or you don't waste time trying to get information that is irrelevant or potentially harmful, depending on what you have to produce.
Yeah, I think it's kind of analogous to a meet and confer. Get on the same page. Don't waste a lot of time, because it is the client's money that you're wasting at the end of the day. And the purpose isn't to do this for no reason. The purpose is to realistically notify the individuals who had their data compromised, and to keep that in mind and to work toward that end. If you can do it cooperatively, that's certainly right. I think that's certainly a positive. So let's talk about the lower branch here of the workflow, which is the unstructured data. So we're talking about email and office files, and it's broader than that as well. You could have PDFs, you could have scanned PDFs or PDFs that are saved and searchable. You can have pictures. You can have, I've seen CAD diagrams. There's all manner of documents that end up getting emailed around depending on what the client is. So getting an understanding of that, it can really vary. So step one, process and filter. We talked about this before. It's really an eDiscovery principle, but the whole concept is you've got a funnel, and you start with a bunch of data going to the top of the funnel, and you want the bottom of that funnel to be as small as possible in a defensible and reasonable manner, because at the end of the day, humans are going to be putting their eyes on this. Humans are going to be documenting what you find and typing in the names and the different PII elements or privacy elements. And that is generally the most expensive part of this process. And it's the same thing that really always has been the case in eDiscovery. Human beings sitting in front of a computer screen, reviewing document after document and typing in information is by far the most expensive part of this process. So we do whatever we can to make that population be smaller, again, in a defensible manner, but then also give them tools to do that in a good way. So one of the things that we do is the assessment or the prospecting process. That's that middle kind of chevron box on the lower branch there. So we want to understand and organize our documents. What do I have? Do I have 500-page PDFs that are semi-searchable and semi-not searchable? Do I have a large population of things that are not really relevant and couldn't possibly have? Do I have a lot of other non-searchable documents like photographs? I've almost always seen that a passport or a driver's license photos show up pretty regularly in doesn't matter what document population, and generally they don't OCR properly. You can't tell anything about that. You won't get any keyword hit out of that. So understanding what those documents look like, using analytics. We had the Legal Tech show here, Legal Week last week here in New York, and everywhere you went, what were they talking about? They're talking about AI. They're talking about analytics still, and although like the predictive coding, TAR, whatever you want to call it, process, it doesn't really work for this because you're not trying to classify documents, you're trying to identify specific data. There are a lot of analytics elements that can be used at this phase. I talked earlier about also regular expression searching, but one of the big things that is part of this process is understanding where are the traps. If you rely on keyword searching, well, what if you have handwritten documents that didn't really OCR very well? What if you have multi-generation photocopies where it looks like it OCRs, but it's not a good enough quality. You don't get good enough results because if you're doing an expression search for a social security number, you have to be pretty precise. It interprets one of those letters as a $sign, and all of a sudden you're not going to find a hit. So designing different ways to get at that data, and there's really a period of time where you've got humans that are assessing. Before you turn it over to the reviewers, you get humans that are assessing those documents to understand, to cull, and then most importantly, to organize them appropriately before you turn them over to those endpoint reviewers who are actually going to do that work.
Brian, can
Chris,
I make a point right there?
Pause for a breath. You may. Please.
Brian, I think sometimes that it's so obvious that we don't think about it, but you just described how you're going to have a team of people looking through different documents, and in the normal eDiscovery kind of manner, maybe you have some stuff that's sensitive and maybe you don't have stuff that's quite as sensitive. In this case, we're dealing with stuff that is entirely sensitive. Every single document, ideally, that you're looking through is something that has something that's confidential in one or more ways. And so it's critical that the people that are going to be doing these reviews, not only do you have them sign an agreement and and agree that they're not going to take what they look at and learn and do something with it, but also that you make that clear up front. That, hey, you're going to be looking at important sensitive data here, and I think setting that tone and that expectation, and then in some ways, you got to monitor people as well to make sure that even the reviewers are being careful. You don't want to have a breach while you're trying to mitigate and figure out who you got to notify about your breach. And so I just mentioned that because I think it gets kind of assumed or dealt with in a cursory kind of way. And I really think it helps to set that expectation for all the team members up front that we're really trying to protect things here, not make things worse. And if you're not committed to that, then we don't want you on our team. The other thing too I wanted to mention was that you talked a little bit, Brian, about photos. You're right, photos like passports, driver's license, but also in the medical industry, there's lots of pictures that have health information in them. And so it can be difficult to try to extract data from a photograph, or even more difficult from a video. So you've got to really understand.
MRI.
That's right. And sometimes there's text on those records and also a picture. So there's a combination of different pieces of information. You really got to understand the different data types and maybe deal with them in different ways. A couple other problem areas are password-protected files, encrypted files. There ought to be some kind of error report that you're getting that identifies the files that you couldn't get to. Maybe that means that if they were password protected and encrypted, maybe they weren't breached, right? You can rule those out.
Right.
But
right.
you ought to know that happened or exists. The other thing is non-English documents. If you're searching for the things only in the English language and you got records that are in Spanish or any other language, then you could potentially be overlooking what you're looking for or only getting part of the population by searching in English. I know there's great tools that do all of they kind of normalize, just like you normalize a database, you try to normalize the language that you're using to search. But in some cases, the better solution is if you realize you've got records entered in a different language, maybe a review team that speaks that language is a better way to have a more accurate understanding of the data that you're looking at.
Yeah, definitely that is the case. And I think to sum all that up, the bottom line is that keywords alone are not the answer to this problem. They are a partial answer, they're a guideline, but there's a lot more to this than just that.
Absolutely, it's a multi-pronged approach. You know, the one point I was going to make about Chris's comment about password-protected files is that a password-protected file, if you're a bad actor, that's a flag that could be the holy grail inside there. Look, as a computer forensics company, BIA can crack passwords. It's not something that's uncommon in our industry. So don't think because it's a password-protected file, it's something you can just put aside. You know, this is also a good opportunity for the lawyers, for the corporations on this webinar to understand that there's also an opportunity to consult with your custodians, with your employees. I've been at BIA for 12 years now. I'm one of those people who has my personal things in my corporate email, purchases of land, apartments, back and forth with medical and doctors. I'm one of those people that if my work email should ever get compromised, there's a treasure trove there. That is not an open invitation for any bad actors to hack my email, but more and more so, especially if you have longevity at a company, our emails are not just corporation. It's not just the personal stuff. It's not just the corporate stuff. It's all part of the puzzle.
And wear this one.
Yes, Ryan drew a bullseye and put me right in the middle of it. Thanks for that.
You're welcome. You're welcome.
Mr. Snowden, if you're out there, please have mercy.
No, it's an excellent point. I mean, the stuff that you find in your own and other people's email boxes is sometimes. I mean, just read the news, and you know it's amazing what you find in email. Okay, so let's talk about capture. So, Chris, you made a great point a minute ago. You know, everyone that works on these things has to be part of that team, and with the understanding that this is very sensitive information, and hopefully you can trust your team. But a lot of time it's contract reviewers that may be doing this. So you're absolutely right. I think there's probably a equal or greater degree of sensitivity in this kind of matter, and I think that the kind of things I've seen is people are absolutely not allowed to have their cell phones at their workstation. USB are disabled, all these kind of things to keep things private. So when they're doing that, we get to the capture, how we're actually getting the data now. So we want to focus on quality. This is a fairly mundane task. People are having to go through these documents and they're typing the information. It's a little different than eDiscovery review because they're actually having to capture names, social security numbers, and all kinds of things. One letter typed wrong leads to a problem downstream, fat fingering or just lack of attention. So focus on quality. Reviewer metrics are important. Are people going too slow? It means they're digging in too much. Are they going too fast? They're not focusing well enough, or maybe they're just a super reviewer and you want to clone them. But it's all these things are things to pay attention to. Also, we talked about the end goal before. In this as well, it's really imperative to work with company and especially with counsel to understand what data is important on this particular matter. What are we going to capture? How are we going to capture it? If you jump into a matter and just start, say, oh, here, I'm going to create these fields that we're going to capture, and counsel's not part of that, you may realize 50,000 documents in that you've missed some key information, and you've got to double back and do some rework, and you don't have the time, and you probably don't have the budget to do that. So, these are all things that are really important. I think it was mentioned earlier that one of the big challenges here is you might have multiple individuals multiple individuals on a document, lists of people with social security numbers. Very common, either in an email or in a document, and planning to be able to get those. So last thing, the deduplication. No matter what you do, I would say it is. I'm going to go out on a limb and say it is impossible to get through this process and get an absolutely unique list at the end of the data capture. There's going to be a deduplication process, just because data comes in at different points. Different documents have, you have John Smith with a social security number, you have John Smith with a username and password, John Smith with an account number. How do you pull all those together? It's a complicated process. You need thinkers, you need people that have database skills, and you also need to work with your client and understand and plan going in what you're going to do. And then at the end, hopefully, you've got a unique, we'll say unique, probably should have put quotes there, but a list of affected individuals that goes to company and council, and at that point, it's up to them to do the actual notification, and then wash your hands, and your job is done.
So look, we've got a few minutes left here, and so much information. Both you and Chris, thank you so much. A couple of questions I think that are relevant and important, and I think will be beneficial for everybody. First one is, what happens if you do this wrong? Chris?
Well, eventually, the people that you produce the information to, people will figure it out, and so it's important to make sure you get it right. But also, if there's things that you're not sure of, you should make that clear in your representations, whether it's to customers or to regulators. And I always stress to clients that it seems obvious, but we need to be accurate with what we're saying. And if we can't be accurate, then we should explain what it is that we don't know. And I think that will go a long way. If you do have something that turns out to be totally different or wrong, if you weren't so adamant about being 100% right and knowing everything, then it gives you a little bit of grace if you have to go back and correct or adjust what you've said before. I don't know if does that answer your question?
It does, yeah. Definitely. So look, with a couple minutes left here, I'd like to say, first of all, thank you for everybody. We're going to do a wrap-up with some final thoughts. There were a lot of questions that were submitted. Unfortunately, we couldn't get to most of them. We will reply to those. We'll post them on the BIA blog, and we will certainly make sure that everybody has a copy of those. But Ryan, any final thoughts before we conclude here?
Yeah, just real quick, 3 points. Just to reiterate, teamwork and cooperation are vital. Communication between and amongst the team and clarity in that communication is absolutely mandatory. And then having a planned workflow, but having some flexibility in that workflow will really, I think, predispose you towards success.
Excellent. Chris, any final thoughts on your end?
Yeah, I think we used to say an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure, and I think we're past the point where we can prevent a breach from happening. It's inevitable. So I like to say now that an ounce of preparation is worth a pound of cure. The more you can prepare and understand what you've got and what you're dealing with before it happens, and even simulate that through tabletop exercises or other things, then the better you can be. The more prepared and easier it is to deal with when a data breach occurs.
Excellent. So we're going to end our webinar on time. We'd like to thank ACEDS. We'd like to thank every single one of you for attending and being part of this today. Thanks to Ryan Bilbrey. Thank you to Chris Dix. And we will see you, hopefully, not when you have your next data breach, but certainly on our next webinar. Thanks for attending, everybody. Have a great day.